This video was made with support from my patrons, whose names are on screen now. If you want to, you can join them today and even get access to exclusive content. The link to my Patreon is in the description, so check it out if you're interested. Anyway, on with the show. The Nürburgring, Suzuka, Laguna Seca. These are the types of racetracks that we're all familiar with seeing in track-focused racing games, and to a degree that's not at all surprising. Much like the cars, the real-world circuits that get chosen to be in these games are often done so because, if not, it would feel like something is missing. Spa-Francorchamps, Circuit de la Sarthe, Fuji Speedway, I could go on. Of course, there are many reasons why we see the same circuits appear in these games over and over again, such as their recognizability, real-life history and legacy, and of course the driving challenge that they offer. But something I've always been fascinated by is when the developers of these games get a little bit weird. They think outside the box and choose tracks that the majority of players have likely never driven in any racing game before, and a lot of the time have never even heard of. These are the courses that could easily be mistaken as fictional ones that were made up for the game, but I assure you that they are very much real. Today, I picked out some of my personal favourite lesser-known circuits to have appeared in well-known racing games. We'll be discussing not just how these courses appeared in their respective games, but also their real-life history, and in some cases, how they even ended up in these games at all. Bear in mind, this list is based on racing games that I have played and am familiar with. Anyway, let's take a look at our first case. At this point, most people know me as the Gran Turismo guy. No idea why, but I suppose the best-selling racing game franchise ever is probably a good place to start. The original Gran Turismo famously came out with a track roster of entirely fictional locations, but Gran Turismo 2 would see the first real-world circuit in the form of Laguna Seca, and since then things have expanded to the point where real circuits now make up almost half of the total locations in Gran Turismo 7. Despite this, Polyphony Digital have always played it quite straight with their real-world circuits. In terms of which ones they pick, generally it's been the more obvious, the better. The 6 locations I mentioned in the intro are all here, and have been for several games now, as well as ones like Daytona, Monza, and Mount Panorama. I think one of the major reasons why they've never felt the urge to include more deep cuts is because their fictional original circuits are such a core part of the series. Nobody does fictional tracks as well as Gran Turismo, so you can understand why they would prefer to just make their own unique courses rather than license some lesser known real ones to fill that void. This way, they can then leave the real locations to the more requested additions. The wishlist circuits, you could call them. That said, I wouldn't be talking about Gran Turismo if it didn't have at least one notable oddity. Gran Turismo 6 has the most circuit locations of any GT game, more than 40 by the end of its life cycle. Within this, we can find a couple of interesting picks. Willow Springs is a circuit that I don't think is appreciated often enough for how much of an oddball it is in current day. The layout of the main Big Willow course has been unchanged for over 70 years. It really is a relic of a bygone era. In its heyday, it was quite a busy circuit, with many SCCA events taking place throughout the 50s and 60s, but since then it's been used almost exclusively for club racing, historic events, and track days. It was often visited for testing by a handful of Formula 1 teams during the 1980s, namely Renault, Lotus, and Williams. But according to the archive on RacingSportsCars.com, it hasn't held an officially sanctioned car race since 1987. So, how exactly did this ribbon of tarmac in the Mojave Desert end up in Gran Turismo? Well, as many of you will likely be saying by now, Willow Springs is not an obscure circuit. It was actually quite well known before it appeared in GT6. Although, the reasons why it's well known are quite different to most other circuits. The 1969 film, The Love Bug, featuring Herbie the Beetle, really put it on the map. And since then, it's appeared in various other media as well. The Willow Springs website even proudly shouts about this, and how it is still available to rent as a filming location. In the realm of racing games, the first game it appeared in was actually Need for Speed Pro Street in 2007. Although you might have not recognised it here given the sheer amount of trackside furniture they dumped all over the place. Needless to say, it's never looked like this in real life. Since then, it's also appeared in Project Cars, iRacing, and the subsequent GT games, GT Sport and GT7. In GT7, they even reference the fact that when it rains, which it does very rarely here, the whole place goes green. Sadly, this isn't possible in the game, but in case you're wondering, here's what it looks like in real life. Not gonna lie, this is kind of cursed, but also pretty cool. Okay, so Willow Springs isn't exactly an obscure circuit, even if it sort of should be, so our next case is much more clear-cut. Another circuit that was new to GT6 was the Ascari Race Resort in Andalusia, Spain. This track was opened in 2003 as a private facility for exclusive members, where they can drive their own cars or use ones provided by the circuit, ranging from sports cars to ex-Formula 1 machines. The layout was inspired by many of the great well-known circuits like the Nürburgring, Spa, Silverstone, etc., and it's seen as a real driving challenge, easy to learn but difficult to master. This circuit was the brainchild of Klaas Zwart, a Dutch businessman. He founded Ascari Cars, a sports car maker based in the UK, named after two-time Italian Formula 1 world champion Alberto Ascari. And of course, Zwart also decided to brand his exclusive circuit under Ascari as well. Much like Willow Springs, the Ascari track isn't known for motorsports. In fact, the only official race I could find that has ever taken place here was a round of the 2012 Moroccan Clio RS Cup. And really, that's because racing isn't the point of this track. You know, despite the fact it's called Ascari Race Resort. But that once again begs the question, how did it make its way into Gran Turismo, a racing game? Well, this all stems from the series producer of Gran Turismo, Kazunori Yamauchi, visiting the area in the summer of 2012. He was actually introduced to the location by the original GT Academy winner Lucas Ordóñez, and in October the circuit was scanned for its appearance in GT6 the following year. In fact, he loved the place so much that it was decided to be the location of the GT6 launch party, along with the nearby city of Ronda. This mirrored the GT5 launch party which was held in Madrid, and at the event, Kazunori was even honoured by having a street in Ronda named after him, Paseo de Kazunori Yamauchi. This area of Spain had quite a big presence in GT6. Not only did Ascari appear as a playable circuit, but Ronda was also featured as a photo travel location. Then, in September 2014, there was an update that included Circuito de la Sierra, a fictional road circuit in Andalusia that measured around 17 miles long and came with its own game mode. And when the long-awaited Course Maker feature finally appeared 1 year later, Andalusia was one of the 4 themes available to base your circuit on. When it comes to Ascari, of course the circuit featured in a handful of races in the main GT mode, but it's somewhat fitting that its most memorable appearance was not in a race. It hosted the final test of the Super License, where the player was tasked with completing a lap of it in the Bugatti Veyron. Needless to say, there was a lot of understeer and quite a few broken PS3 controllers as well. In GT6 there is only one variation of the track, the full circuit, but in reality there is a total of 6 possible layouts. Polyphony seemingly just ignored the shorter alternate options, which is a frustrating trend that they still continue to this day. It's worth noting that Ascari Cars went bankrupt in 2010, but Ascari Race Resort, now simply called Circuito Ascari, still exists regardless. In 2022, Klaas Zwart sold the resort to 2 companies from Switzerland and Argentina, but the Ascari name still remains, at least for now. Fun fact, Ascari's old HQ in Banbury is now the UK base of the Haas Formula 1 team. Of course, the real irony of the situation is that Gran Turismo never featured any of Ascari's cars, but did feature the Ascari track, which was far less well known. Ascari has yet to return in any of the later Gran Turismo games, which means that, to date, GT6 is the only game it's ever officially appeared in. Ascari as a venue has always been about exclusivity, and when it comes to real-life circuits in racing games, frankly, it doesn't get any more exclusive than that. When anybody says Need for Speed, racing on closed circuits is likely not what comes to mind. This franchise started off with races on public roads, and into the 2000s this morphed into more densely packed urban environments. But for a brief period in the late 2000s and early 2010s, Need for Speed tried their hand at track-focused racing games. The first of these was Need for Speed Pro Street in 2007, developed by EA Black Box. The main theme of this game was to take illegal street racing to the track in sanctioned events on closed courses, hence the name Pro Street. As a result, this would be the first Need for Speed game to feature officially licensed real-world circuits, and the selection on offer was quite interesting. Instead of going with the more tried and trusted picks, they went all out in choosing as many unique circuits as they could. I've already mentioned Willow Springs, which made its racing game debut here, but there were plenty more. Autopolis is a circuit on the Japanese island of Kyushu. It was briefly in the spotlight in the early 90s when it opened, but after losing its provisional slot on the 1993 F1 calendar after the company that owned the circuit went bust, it faded into obscurity. In the years since, it then became a fixture for many domestic series like Super GT and Formula Nippon before appearing in Pro Street. Side note, it also has possibly the best name for a racetrack ever, Autopolis. It's just perfect. This wasn't the first time that it had appeared in a racing game, but for many people, myself included, Pro Street was the first game we ever saw it in. That sentiment is also true for many of the other circuits in this game. Ebisu is quite a well-known location, particularly for drifting, with several different layouts present. Again, it's one of those tracks that became fairly well known outside of racing, so it's always been somewhat overlooked when it comes to racing games. Pro Street featured both the South Course and West Course layouts, so it's nice that it received a bit of attention here. Mondello Park in Ireland is also present. This track was actually the first, and so far only, permanent circuit in Ireland and has hosted some major championships, like the British Touring Car Championship, British Superbike Championship, and even a round of the FIA Sports Car Championship in 2001. Since the financial crash of 2008, it's hosted almost exclusively domestic events, including rallycross and drifting. In terms of other US tracks besides Willow Springs, we also have Texas World Speedway and Portland International Raceway. Both of these circuits have hosted major US series in real life, like IndyCar and NASCAR, but were often overlooked for the more glamorous venues such as Daytona and Laguna Seca. Sadly, Texas World Speedway was demolished in 2018, but it still lives on in Pro Street. To me, it seems pretty clear that choosing these lesser-known circuits was a very deliberate ploy, and honestly, I really respect them for it. It does make the game feel quite unique in that sense, and I feel like the race day format, with its multiple event types, does emphasize each track even more. Of course, Pro Street does also have a handful of original designs, but it's important to note that none of them are traditional racetracks, but rather closed-off sections of public roads. The only real circuit that I haven't mentioned yet is Infineon, and that's because it was more well known than the others, but still nowhere near as Spa or Silverstone, for example. But speaking of tracks like Spa and Silverstone, that ties in neatly to our next game, Need for Speed Shift. Released in 2009, Shift was a sort of pseudo-sequel to Pro Street, in the sense that it took place solely on closed courses. Truthfully, the game is completely different in design and scope, and was even created by another developer, Slightly Mad Studios. More on them later. With this game, we would see more of the usual circuits start to creep in. Spa, Silverstone, Nürburgring, Laguna Seca, all of these would appear in Shift. But there were still a few holdovers from Pro Street as well, like Willow Springs and Ebisu. The game also featured more traditional original circuits, like Alpental and Glendale, the types of tracks that you could easily mistake as real if you didn't know better. Unfortunately for us, Shift didn't really have any new circuits that you could describe as obscure. There was one exception, however. This track was easy to miss, given that it wasn't a new location. Autopolis also made the transition to Shift, but along with the main circuit, you could also find Autopolis Lakeside. This layout is found within the main Autopolis circuit, and so could easily be neglected. It doesn't appear in Gran Turismo 7, where the main circuit is featured, and as far as I'm aware, it hasn't been seen in any other series either. It's a very narrow course that starts relatively fast, before ending with a complex of slower corners. In real life, it's used mostly for drifting, recently being seen in the 3rd division of Formula Drift Japan in November 2023. But apart from that, it isn't used for much, which is why you likely haven't seen it outside of Shift. But in 2011, Shift would receive a sequel, Shift 2 Unleashed. Shift 2 would have twice as many circuits as Shift 1, including many new real locations. So let's take a look at the most interesting. Brno is a circuit in Czechia that is mostly known for motorcycle racing. That said, it has hosted international touring car and GT races on occasion, so its appearance here wasn't completely from left field. Another would be Dijon-Prenois. This French circuit hosted Formula 1 throughout the 70s and 80s, and sports car events until the early 2000s. There was a single round of the DTM in 2009, but since then it's been used solely for domestic events. Irwindale Speedway, or Toyota Speedway at Irwindale as it was known at the time, is an American oval course that also has an infield section. Interestingly, it became most well known for drifting, having hosted D1 Grand Prix for several years starting in 2003. From this, it earned the nickname the House of Drift. It was announced in 2017 that the circuit would be shutting down and replaced with an outlet mall, but after a change of management, it was able to keep operating. Shift 2 features the oval course and 2 drift layouts. And now we come to Enna Pergusa in Sicily. This is one of my favourite tracks in Shift 2, mostly because it's just so different to anything else. It's essentially just a big misshapen oval with some clumsy chicanes inserted to reduce speeds. The main challenge of this circuit is to carry as much speed as you can through the chicanes without suffering a violent accident. In that sense, it's pretty accurate to real life. But in real life, the circuit hosted Formula 3000 races until the mid-90s, and then the European Touring Car and FIA GT Championships until the mid-2000s. After that, the FIA revoked the circuit's license on safety grounds. The main problem this track has always had, and the reason why the only thing that's changed in its more than 70-year history is the insertion of the chicanes, is space. On the inside of the circuit is a lake, and beyond that, the whole area is a protected nature reserve, meaning that the circuit can only occupy a very narrow space. As such, this is why it still retains its awkward-looking chicanes to this very day. The track eventually reopened after some modifications in 2011, the same year that it featured in Shift 2, and since then has been used mostly for national events. And when it comes to the Need for Speed franchise as a whole, that's all she wrote. After Shift 2, EA never took this series back to the track, instead solely focusing on open world races that had still continued to come out alongside these games anyway. This was an era when they really threw everything at the wall, and sadly, games like Pro Street and Shift just didn't stick. I like these games quite a lot. Even Shift and Shift 2, despite their obvious flaws, are games that I think are really interesting and still have quite a lot to enjoy in them. And of course, the inclusion of these outside-of-the-box tracks is just another thing that adds to the intrigue of these games. Race Driver Grid was released by Codemasters in 2008 as a spiritual successor to the Toka Race Driver series. Those games had their fair share of interesting deep cuts when it came to the real circuits, so it's not too surprising that the Grid games have as well. The original Grid only had a handful of real circuits, but there were still a couple of interesting ones. Istanbul Park was a circuit that appeared in Toka Race Driver 3, and it was carried forward into Race Driver Grid just a couple of years later. Now, this isn't an obscure circuit by any stretch, having hosted Formula 1 on 9 occasions from 2005 to 2021, but it is a track that you rarely see in racing games outside of the F1 titles. I suppose then it's quite convenient that Codemasters acquired the F1 license for 2009, and so the track was able to be reused in those games as well. Circuito del Jarama was another track to make a rare video game appearance here. This track has hosted top-level racing, both on 4 wheels and 2 wheels, but by the mid-2000s it had faded from relevance. Still, it's quite a fun and flowing track to drive, with a rich history to boot. Grid was followed up by Grid 2 in 2013, but sadly it doesn't have many unique tracks worth talking about. Istanbul Park and Jarama were both absent, and the rest of the choices were fairly ordinary, like Brands Hatch, Indianapolis, and the Red Bull Ring. But just 1 year later, we would receive yet another sequel, Grid Autosport. This game had a much stronger emphasis on pure circuit racing than the previous title. Not only did it bring back some tracks that were left out of Grid 2, like Istanbul Park and Jarama, but it also added plenty of new ones. The one I'd like to single out as the most interesting is Mont Tremblant. Set on the outskirts of a Canadian ski resort, this circuit hosted both IndyCar and Formula 1 on a handful of occasions in the late 60s, but once again had slipped into obscurity by the 2000s. It was then purchased by Lawrence Stroll, a man who you may already know as the current owner of Aston Martin and their F1 team, as well as the father of driver Lance Stroll. The circuit was renovated to bring it up to safety standards, including the addition of a clumsy chicane in the middle of the fast sweeping turn 1. Fortunately, Grid Autosport doesn't include the chicane, because otherwise this circuit is a pleasure to drive. The layout has barely changed since the 1960s and I love it. More people really need to know about this track. Despite everything, this circuit still remains relatively forgotten, with its last major race being a one-off round of the Champ Car World Series in 2007. Stroll also recently sold the circuit in 2022. After Autosport, it would take another 5 whole years before we would see the next game in the Grid series. The franchise was rebooted with Grid. Like any game that's simply named after its own series, the year is almost always attached to it, so it's known as Grid 2019. This game once again included at least a couple of real-life circuits worth talking about. Sydney Motorsport Park is one of them. This track had appeared in Toka Race Driver 3 when it was previously named Eastern Creek Raceway. The circuit had hosted the Australian round of MotoGP for a few years in the 90s, but has become more well known as a venue for the Aussie Supercars Championship. That said, it still does host one major international event in the form of the World Time Attack Challenge. But in Grid 2019, there is another circuit that is quite a bit less well known than this one. Zhejiang Circuit was opened in 2016 in the Chinese city of Shaojing, and Grid was the first time that it featured in any major racing title. The design of the track is quite twisty, with plenty of elevation changes. This was yet another venue to follow the membership model, like I mentioned with the Ascari Race Resort. The idea being that wealthy patrons would subscribe to a membership to the circuits that would allow them to do laps in their own performance cars, or ones they can rent from the circuit itself, whilst enjoying various other amenities and luxuries that are available on site. That said, unlike Ascari, this circuit does hold races regularly, which included a round of the TCR International Series in 2017. Since then, it's hosted mostly national and regional championships, like TCR Asia and the GT Asia series, but the memberships seem to provide the majority of its business. Regardless, out of all of the circuits to have featured in the Grid franchise, Zhejiang has to be the one with the least amount of recognizability. With each of the 4 other tracks from this series that I've mentioned, they were all in the limelight at one point in time through hosting major championships. That has yet to happen for Zhejiang, and it may never. The circuit is practically unknown outside of China. All of this makes its inclusion in Grid 2019, and the most recent game in the series, Grid Legends, all the more interesting. Remember Slightly Mad Studios? Well, it turns out that they had quite a knack for including lesser-known circuits in their games. After EA pulled the plug on the Shift series, SMS decided to go solo and started developing their new project based on the game engine from Shift and Shift 2. This would become Project Cars, which officially released in May 2015, published by Bandai Namco. Being based in the UK, SMS decided to feature many of their local circuits in Project Cars. It included the tried and trusted Silverstone, Brands Hatch, and Donington Park, but also the far less well-known Snetterton, Alton Park, and Cadwell Park. Each of these are circuits that you would likely be unfamiliar with unless you happen to follow UK motorsports. Let's start with Snetterton. Like most major UK circuits, Snetterton started off life as an airfield before being converted into a racetrack after World War II. Over the years, this track has hosted pretty much every single major national championship, including British GT, British F3, British Superbikes, and of course, the British Touring Car Championship. It even held the country's first ever 24-hour race in 1980. What's important to note is that Snetterton has virtually never hosted an international championship, only domestic ones. And this is true for many other UK circuits as well. In 2011, the track was redesigned to feature an infield section, and it would be this new version that would appear in Project Cars with all 3 possible layouts. Alton Park is up next. Like Snetterton, it's hosted all of the major UK championships, but it did also have a brush with stardom in the early days, when many international drivers would visit for sports car and single-seater meetings. Like many UK circuits, Alton Park is, and has always been, quite narrow, and so the days of high-powered F1 and Group 6 machines didn't last too long. But speaking of narrow, Alton Park can't hold a candle in that department to the final UK circuit in this game, Cadwell Park. This track has been described as a roller coaster, and it's easy to see why, but the lack of space available really makes it a unique challenge. Motorbikes have always been the name of the game at Cadwell, but in the early days there was a fair amount of car racing as well. Since the 80s, this has been scaled back, and now the only four-wheeled action you'll find are track days, club races, and time attack events. A round of the British Superbike Championship is about the only major event this place still holds, but it's definitely a sight to see. The section of track known as the Mountain regularly sees riders get airborne. There's really nothing else like it. I suppose Cadwell Park has to be the most bizarre track choice in this game. It is Project Cars, not Project Bikes after all. But this track is still awesome to drive on 4 wheels, and I'm really glad that they included it because it just offers something so unique. It says a lot when the real-life lap record around here is held by a kart. That is just not something you'll see outside of literal kart tracks. Project Cars 2 released in 2017, and it added one more unique UK circuit, Knock Hill. This is Scotland's premier racetrack and has all the hallmarks of a classic UK club circuit. It's narrow, undulating, and makes for some intense racing. Yet again, it's another staple of the national racing calendar, with the BTCC and BSB being the headline events. Project Cars 2 even features the Rallycross layouts, which only officially reopened in 2019. However, it's not just lesser-known UK circuits that have gotten representation here. There's also a handful of international circuits that you don't see very often in racing games, if ever. A personal favourite of mine is this, Sportsland Sugo. Also introduced in Project Cars 2, this is a relatively old-school Japanese circuit with little in the way of runoff. It kind of exists in this bubble of semi-obscure Japanese tracks, nowhere near the popularity of Suzuka, Fuji, or even Motegi. In this sense, you could consider it as the spiritual replacement for Autopolis from Slightly Mad's previous Shift games. In real life, its only major international exposure came from the World Superbike Championship, which held events from 1988 to 2003. It has also hosted domestic events for F3000 single-seaters, Group A touring cars, and Group C prototypes in the past. Nowadays, its major attractions are Super Formula and Super GT, where it's become something of a fan-favourite venue for the often wild and unpredictable races it seems to produce. Now, when talking about tracks with historical significance that have been somewhat forgotten with time, Project Cars 2 also brought one of these as well. Rouen-les-Essarts, often just called Rouen, was a French road circuit that opened in 1950. Its claim to fame was hosting the Formula 1 French Grand Prix on 5 occasions throughout the 1960s. Project Cars 2 features two layouts, the full circuit and the short circuit. In reality, the full circuit represents the track as it was from 1955 to 1971, and the short circuit from 1972 onwards. As it turns out, Project Cars 2 was not the first SMS game to feature this track. That's because it also appeared in Shift 2 Unleashed. However, it was only available as part of the Legends DLC pack, which also included classic versions of Silverstone, Monza, Hockenheimring, and Dijon, so most players never drove it in that game. The track was closed for good in 1994, and all trace of it has since been demolished. Once again, this is a circuit that is able to live on in digital form, well beyond its real-life counterparts. But stepping back to the original Project Cars, we still have a few more places to mention. Zhuhai International Circuit was China's first purpose-built racetrack when it opened in 1996. A relatively stop-start layout, it held rounds of the BPR Global GT Championship, FIA GT Championship, and A1 GP. The track has been left behind somewhat in recent years, as China's massive economic growth has resulted in many more circuits springing up all over the country, but it still gets some global recognition thanks to Project Cars. Random fun fact, Zhuhai is the circuit where the eccentric Gelée Vertigo took its first international victory in 2005. Albeit it was one of only 2 cars in its class, but that's a minor detail, and the real car has been restored to the exact spec in which it won the race. Anyway, I think the single most obscure circuit to feature in this game has to be this next entry. New Zealand doesn't have a huge amount of racetracks, but even still, there are a few notable ones. There was Pukekohe, which was well known for hosting the New Zealand round of V8 supercars for many years, as well as tracks like Manfield and Teretonga, where the New Zealand Grand Prix took place on many occasions. But SMS seemed to think that these were too obvious, so instead, they included Ruapuna Park. This track was initially added in July 2015 as part of a DLC pack, making it the first downloadable track to be added to the game post-release. Even still, I'm certain that most players, both now and at the time, have never heard of this circuit before, and Project Cars represents the only time it's ever been officially playable in any game. As for the layout, there isn't too much to say about it. It's decent, but nothing special. One thing I do appreciate about it though is how many different layouts it has, 5 in total. In real life, this track has only ever hosted domestic events, as you might expect. It was previously part of the NZ V8 Championship until 2018, and the Toyota Racing Series until 2009. It even hosted the New Zealand Grand Prix for a couple of years in the late 90s, but as of now, it's used mainly for track days and club events. For what it's worth, I tried finding out why this track in particular was chosen to be in the game, but it doesn't seem like there was any explanation given. Not from the developers, nor the circuit owners. Much like all of the other tracks in the original Project Cars, the ones I've mentioned here were carried forward into the 2 subsequent sequels. The tracks really were one of the best things about Project Cars as a franchise. They had such a good mix of globally iconic circuits and more niche national level ones. It's definitely something I miss now that the series is dead and buried. So those were some of my favourite obscure circuits in racing games. In case you're wondering, I did consider Forza Motorsport as well, given that it's a series I also have a history with. Unfortunately, Turn 10 have always played it straight with their real circuits. I can't really justify making a whole section just to mention Lime Rock Park and Virginia International Raceway. There just isn't enough to work with, possibly because, like Gran Turismo, they've always had a decent selection of original circuits anyway. If there's one major takeaway from this video, it's that it should be clear that I really love when racing game developers make these interesting choices when it comes to their track rosters. Last year, I made a video talking about the blueprint of a racing game I would like to create one day, and part of that included a track list featuring several real-world circuits that rarely, if ever, feature in racing games. The point I'm trying to make is that there are so many unique and interesting circuits that still remain untapped, waiting for their chance to shine. I am aware that I'm just scraping the tip of the iceberg with this video, so please let me know in the comments, what are some of your favourite obscure circuits in racing games? And also, are there any lesser known real tracks that you wish appeared in more racing games? I've definitely got a few of those myself. But for now, thanks for making it to the end of this video, and as always, have a good one.